Barron Trump stepped out of the sleek black SUV, the chilly New York air brushing against his face as his security detail scanned the sidewalk. At 17, his towering height and quiet demeanor often drew curious glances. But today, something else captured his attention. Just outside the entrance to a cafe, a disheveled man sat hunched over, clutching a cardboard sign that read, "Former teacher, just trying to survive." Barron's eyes widened. The man's face was familiar, though, now lined with exhaustion and framed by a scraggly beard. It was Mr. Whitaker, his history teacher from middle school, once passionate and full of energy, now unrecognizably broken. Memories of Mr. Whitaker's animated lessons flooded back. He had a way of making history feel alive, inspiring Barron, and countless others to think critically about the world. Without hesitation, Barron approached him. "Mr. Whitaker?" he said softly. The man looked up, his eyes clouded but still carrying a flicker of the spark Barron remembered. "Do I know you?" he asked hesitantly. "It's Barron. Barron Trump. You taught me history." Mr. Whitaker's face shifted, a mix of recognition and embarrassment washing over him. "Barron," he murmured, his voice cracking. "I remember you. You were one of my best students." Barron crouched down, ignoring the murmurs of passers-by and the concerned whispers from his security team. "What happened to you?" he asked gently. Mr. Whitaker sighed, looking down at his weathered hands. "Life happened," he said bitterly. "The school cut budgets, and I was let go. Then my wife got sick. Medical bills piled up. I tried everything, but it all spiraled out of control. Now I'm here." Barron felt a pang of guilt. He had grown up in luxury, shielded from the harsh realities that others faced. But here was a man who had once given so much to his students, now reduced to this. "Come with me," Barron said firmly. Mr. Whitaker hesitated. "I can't just, look at me," he said, gesturing to his tattered clothes. But Barron was resolute. "You're coming with me," he insisted, signaling to his security team. "We'll figure this out." An hour later, Mr. Whitaker sat in a private room at a nearby hotel, freshly showered and wearing clean clothes provided by Barron's team. He looked around, visibly overwhelmed. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm just some washed-up teacher." Barron leaned forward, his expression earnest. "You're not just anything. You made a difference in my life, and in the lives of so many others. It's my turn to help you." Over the next few days, Barron worked tirelessly to get Mr. Whitaker back on his feet. He connected him with job placement services, covered his medical debts, and even reached out to former students who remembered their beloved teacher. Stories poured in about how Mr. Whitaker had inspired them. Some were now teachers themselves, others pursuing careers in history or public service. As word spread, the story of Barron's kindness went viral, but he brushed off the media frenzy. "This isn't about me," he told reporters. "It's about giving back to someone who gave so much." Months later, Mr. Whitaker stood in front of a classroom once more, his passion reignited. And though life had tested him in unimaginable ways, he now had a second chance, all because a former student had stopped to care. The experience left Barron changed too. He began using his platform to highlight the struggles of educators and advocate for better support systems. And every time he saw Mr. Whitaker thriving in his element, he was reminded of a simple but powerful truth. One act of kindness can change a life, and sometimes it can change the world. As the months turned into years, Barron and Mr. Whitaker's bond grew stronger. Their story had become an inspiration to many, but for them, it was more than just a feel-good tale. It was a testament to the power of human connection and the ripple effects of kindness. Mr. Whitaker, now back in the classroom, had a renewed sense of purpose. His new position was at an underfunded school in the heart of the city, where many students faced challenges similar to the ones that had derailed his own life. He poured his heart into his work, using his story not as a tale of defeat, but as a lesson in resilience and hope. He often told his students, "The world can knock you down, but there's always a way to rise, especially when someone believes in you." Barron, on the other hand, found himself drawn to a cause he hadn't considered before: education reform. He began visiting schools across the country, sitting down with teachers, students, and administrators to understand their struggles. With his family's resources and influence, he launched an initiative called Bridges for Educators, aimed at providing financial aid, resources, and mental health support for teachers. But Barron didn't stop there. Inspired by Mr. Whitaker's story, he partnered with private donors and organizations to create a scholarship fund for students from low-income families pursuing careers in education. At the launch event, Mr. Whitaker was the keynote speaker, sharing his journey and the role Barron played in turning his life around. "The truth is," Mr. Whitaker said, addressing a room full of educators and philanthropists, "we all have the power to change someone's life." Barron didn't just see me as a homeless man, he saw me as a human being, someone who mattered. That's the kind of vision we need in this world, not just in education, but everywhere. The audience gave him a standing ovation, but Barron, seated in the front row, simply smiled. For him, this wasn't about recognition. It was about making a difference. Years later, as Barron prepared to give a speech at an international education summit, he received a handwritten letter. It was from one of Mr. Whitaker's current students. The young girl wrote about how Mr. Whitaker had inspired her to dream bigger and pursue her love for history, despite the challenges she faced at home. She ended the letter with, "Thank you for helping Mr. Whitaker, because now he's helping kids like me." Barron folded the letter carefully, his heart swelling with pride. He realized then that his decision to stop that day on the sidewalk had set off a chain reaction of goodness, one that was still unfolding. It wasn't just about saving one teacher or helping a single school, it was about igniting a movement, a belief that no one is too small to make a difference, and no one is too far gone to be saved. And so, as Barron took the stage, he began. His speech not with statistics or lofty promises, but with a simple message: kindness is contagious. Pass it on. As the years passed, Barron's message of kindness and education reform continued to spread like wildfire. Bridges for Educators became a global movement, touching lives far beyond what he had initially imagined. Schools were being revitalized. Teachers were being given the tools they needed to thrive, and students, especially those from underserved communities, were finding new hope. Mr. Whitaker, now widely regarded as a symbol of resilience and the power of second chances, had become a sought-after speaker. Despite his growing popularity, he remained firmly rooted in the classroom, teaching and mentoring the next generation. His students adored him, not just for his engaging lessons, but for his openness about his struggles and the importance of perseverance. One day, as Mr. Whitaker was wrapping up a lecture on the civil rights movement, a student raised her hand. "Mr. Whitaker," she began hesitantly, "do you think it's possible for someone like me to make a difference in the world?" He paused, looking at the young girl who reminded him so much of himself, once uncertain, but brimming with untapped potential. "Absolutely," he said with conviction. "Change doesn't always come from people in power. It starts with ordinary people doing extraordinary things. You're proof of that." The girl smiled, her eyes shining with determination. Meanwhile, Barron's work had expanded into other areas. He started collaborating with international organizations to address systemic barriers in education worldwide. From building schools in remote villages to implementing technology programs in urban centers, his influence grew far beyond what anyone had expected from the quiet, reserved boy he had once been. One day, while visiting a rural school in South America, Barron was approached by a group of children carrying a tattered book. It was a history textbook, one that had been donated by a program funded through Bridges for Educators. The children eagerly showed him their favorite chapters, their excitement infectious. In that moment, Barron was reminded of Mr. Whitaker's words, "We all have the power to change someone's life." It wasn't just a slogan, it was a truth that guided everything he did. Back in New York, Mr. Whitaker received an unexpected letter. It was an invitation to the White House, where Barron, now an influential advocate for global education, was to be honored for his contributions. Despite his humility, Barron had accepted the recognition on one condition, that Mr. Whitaker be there to share the moment with him. At the ceremony, Barron stood at the podium, the room filled with world leaders, educators, and students. But his eyes were on Mr. Whitaker seated in the front row. "People often ask me what inspired me to start this journey," Barron began. "The answer is simple: a teacher. A teacher who didn't just teach history but taught me the value of humanity, resilience, and hope. Without him, none of this would exist." The crowd erupted in applause as Mr. Whitaker wiped a tear from his eye. For a man who had once felt invisible, the moment was overwhelming. After the ceremony, the two stood on the steps of the White House, taking in the gravity of how far they had come. "Never thought I'd end up here," Mr. Whitaker said with a chuckle. "Neither did I," Barron replied. "But here we are, and there's so much more to do." As they walked away, the sun setting behind them, it was clear that their story was far from over. Together they had proven that even the smallest act of kindness could spark a chain reaction, transforming lives and changing the world, one person, one teacher, one student at a time. In the months following the White House ceremony, Barron and Mr. Whitaker remained deeply involved in their shared mission to uplift education. Their partnership became a model for how individuals from vastly different walks of life could come together to create meaningful change. One evening, Barron received an email from a young teacher in Detroit. She shared how she had been on the verge of leaving the profession due to burnout, lack of resources, and the emotional toll of her work. But after attending a workshop funded by Bridges for Educators and hearing Mr. Whitaker's story, she found new inspiration to stay and fight for her students. "I thought I was invisible," the teacher wrote, "but now I know I'm part of something bigger. Thank you for reminding me that teachers matter." Barron forwarded the email to Mr. Whitaker, who responded with a simple message: "This is why we do what we do." Meanwhile, Mr. Whitaker continued making waves in his community. His efforts extended beyond the classroom. He organized weekend study, programs, mentorship initiatives, and even a food drive to support students' families. His school became a beacon of hope in an area once plagued by despair, with graduation rates climbing and more students pursuing higher education than ever before. One of his students, Jamal, had been struggling to stay in school while helping his single mother support their family. Inspired by Mr. Whitaker's encouragement, Jamal took a leap of faith and applied for a scholarship from the program Barron had established. Months later, he received the news. He had been awarded a full ride to college. At the scholarship dinner, Jamal spoke through tears, thanking Mr. Whitaker and Barron for showing him that his dreams were possible. "You believed in me when I didn't. Believe in myself," Jamal said. "I won't waste this opportunity." As Barron's initiatives expanded internationally, he invited Mr. Whitaker to join him on a trip to Kenya, where they were opening a new school funded by the program. For Mr. Whitaker, it was a life-changing experience. Seeing the joy and eagerness in the faces of children who now had access to education reminded him of the universal power of knowledge. During the opening ceremony, Barron gave a speech to the community. But this time, he stepped aside and handed the microphone to Mr. Whitaker. "Education is the great equalizer," Mr. Whitaker began, his voice steady and full of emotion. "It doesn't matter where you come from or what challenges you face. With the right support, every child has the potential to achieve greatness. And I'm living proof that it's never too late to rebuild, to dream, and to make a difference." The crowd erupted in applause, and for a moment, Barron stood back, letting his mentor shine. As the years went on, the story of Barron and Mr. Whitaker became a symbol of hope and the power of human connection. Documentaries were made, books were written, and awards were given, but for the two of them, the real reward was the impact they saw every day. One evening, as they sat together on a quiet bench overlooking a bustling city, Barron turned to Mr. Whitaker. "Do you ever think about how crazy all of this is?" Barron asked. "How one chance meeting on a sidewalk changed everything?" Mr. Whitaker smiled, the lines on his face deepening with wisdom. "It wasn't chance, Barron. It was choice. You chose to stop. You chose to care. And that choice has made all the difference." Barron nodded, the weight of those words settling in his heart. He realized then that their story wasn't just about two people. It was about what happens when humanity triumphs over indifference, when action replaces apathy, and when one small act of kindness lights a spark that can illuminate the world. And as they sat there, watching the city lights flicker, like stars, they knew their work was far from over. The world was still waiting, and they were ready to keep making it better. Together. Years passed, and Barron and Mr. Whitaker's impact continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways neither could have foreseen. What had started as a personal act of kindness had blossomed into a global movement, transforming communities, rebuilding lives, and redefining the value of education. One day, as Barron prepared for a major address at the United Nations on global education reform, he received a video message. It was from Jamal, the once struggling student who had earned a scholarship years earlier. Now a college graduate, Jamal had started his own nonprofit dedicated to mentoring young students in underserved neighborhoods. In the video, Jamal stood in front of a small but growing group of young volunteers. "Mr. Trump, Mr. Whitaker," he said with a confident smile, "because of you, I learned that even the smallest steps can create the biggest waves. This is my way of paying it forward. Thank you for believing in me and teaching me to believe in others." Barron played the video for Mr. Whitaker that evening. Watching it, Mr. Whitaker's eyes glistened with tears. "He's exactly what we dreamed of," he said, his voice full of pride. "He's proof that the chain continues." Barron's UN speech was a defining moment. Standing before world leaders, activists, and educators, he spoke with passion and clarity about the need for equitable education worldwide. But he didn't focus solely on policies or statistics. Instead, he shared the deeply personal story of his encounter with Mr. Whitaker, the teacher who had once been homeless and forgotten, and how their journey together had inspired a movement. "We often think change starts at the top," Barron said, his voice steady. "But real change begins in moments of compassion, in seeing the humanity in someone else and deciding to act. Every child deserves a chance to learn, and every teacher deserves the support to inspire." The audience erupted into applause, and as Barron stepped off the stage, he felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just his mission anymore, it was the world's. Years later, Barron and Mr. Whitaker co-authored a book titled The Ripple Effect: How Kindness and Education Can Change the World. The book chronicled their intertwined journeys, the lives they'd touched, and the lessons they'd learned. It became a bestseller, sparking a wave of grassroots movements and inspiring countless individuals to take action in their own communities. One particular story from the book resonated deeply with readers. The tale of how Barron, as a teenager, had stopped on a cold sidewalk to help his former teacher, a moment that seemed small at the time but had grown into something extraordinary. It was a reminder that every decision, no matter how insignificant it might seem, has the potential to change the world. In their later years, Barron and Mr. Whitaker often reflected on their journey. Sitting together on a quiet porch overlooking a vast sunlit landscape, they shared memories, laughter, and moments of quiet gratitude. "Do you ever regret that day on the sidewalk?" Mr. Whitaker asked with a teasing smile. Barron chuckled, shaking his head. "Not for a second. If anything, I regret not stopping sooner." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the sun dipping below the horizon. Finally, Mr. Whitaker spoke, his voice soft but resolute. "You know, Barron, people always talk about legacy, but I think the real legacy isn't in buildings or awards or even movements. It's in the lives you touch. That's what lasts." Barron nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And we've touched a lot of lives, haven't we?" Mr. Whitaker smiled, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of a life well lived. "More than we'll ever know." As the stars began to emerge, one by one, their light seemed to echo the countless sparks of change the two had ignited together. And though their story was nearing its final chapters, its impact would continue to unfold, written, into the lives of every teacher, student, and soul they had inspired along the way.